A Concise History of Imperial Russia. Chapter 1. Russia at the cusp between the 17th and 18th centuries. Russia's geopolitical and economic situation in the late 17th century was extremely dire. The climate and environment of East European plain, where the core area of Russian state building was located, was hardly favorable for agriculture, which was central to the economies of those times. Compared to most European countries, growing season for crops was relatively short. That, along with frequent freezing weather spells, both in spring and fall, poor soils across most of the country's land area, and a number of other factors made harvests poor. In turn, low productivity of farming made it difficult to accumulate sufficient surplus resources required to build up defense capabilities and support cultural growth. Dramatically lower population density than in the rest of Europe made it impossible to have a comparable level of national infrastructure. That handicap was further compounded by the fact that during catastrophic Mongol invasion of the 13th century it was the most densely settled and economically productive areas of medieval Kievan Rus that suffered the worst devastation. Russian statehood fell into decline. Peripheral northeastern Russia came under the vassalage of Mongol-founded state of Golden Horde, while the core areas of Old Rus became part of first the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, Lithuanian Russian state, and then of Polish-Lithuanian state. While in pre-Mongol period Rus was an integral part of a wider European community, it now became culturally and politically isolated. The whole history of ascendancy of the Principality of Moscow, or the Muscovy state period of Russian history, was one of the struggles to revive the lost meaning of Russian statehood. Those struggles were long, but ultimately met with little success. It took Moscow over 2 centuries to reunite even the lands that remained under sovereign Russian rulers, that is to say the principalities not ruled by foreign powers, principalities of Tver and Ryazan, and the states of Novgorod and Pskov were annexed only at the end of 15th and early 16th century. Even as newly strengthened Russian state adopted a more assertive foreign policy in mid-16th century, it won no gains along the western frontier. Mopping up successor khanates of decrepit and broken up Golden Horde was successful, but clashes with European neighbors essentially brought no gains. While in the eastern direction Russia's boundaries advanced by thousands of kilometers, along the western frontiers there was no advance to speak of. Moreover, in the early 17th century, the very continued existence of the Russian state hung in the balance under concerted onslaught by Poland and Sweden. By the end of the period of so-called gathering, or unification, of lands of central Russia, in the first third of 16th century, or at the start of Ivan the Terrible's reign, Russia's western border ran close to Smolensk and Chernigov, but a century later, and even into mid-17th century, it was pushed back even closer to Moscow itself as Muscovy lost some earlier gains. Having imbibed too much Asianness in its successful struggle with foes to the east, Russia now found itself incapable of countering European foes to the west. Some temporary successes notwithstanding, the absolute majority of wars with adversaries from European west either ended in a draw, or brought additional losses of territory. In those wars, Russia sought advance along 2 strategically important directions. One was to break through to the Baltic coast and return erstwhile Baltic possessions. Prior to German conquest, both banks of western Dvina River were owned by Russian princes receiving tribute from the Liv and Let tribes, while native Estonian population was in dependency to Novgorod and Pskov, and part of Estland with the city of Yuriev, Tartu in Estonia today, was actually part of Kievan Rus. Another thrust sought to regain lands in the west, which after the Tatar-Mongol invasion became part of Lithuania and later of Polish-Lithuanian state. Along both of those fronts, 2 centuries of struggles brought less than modest gains. With the exception of left bank Ukraine, which was annexed not by Moscow's conquest, but thanks to the sentiment of its population, by the end of Muscovy period Russia's western border was less advantageous than before Ivan the Terrible's reign. With poor conditions for farming, economic weakness of the country was exacerbated by another factor that was directly due to its geopolitical situation. being landlocked excluded the country from bulk maritime trade, something open to most European countries. Of all forms of economic activity then available, maritime commerce was the most profitable and beneficial for economy at large. It served as the key driver of economic development for the most successful powers of that time. By contrast, in Russia even overland trade, which brings fewer benefits, was significantly hampered by the country's geography. Its huge expanses accounted for sparse road network, while long winters and extended periods of impassable roads during spring snowmelt and fall rains pushed transportation costs through the roof. That said, even if the country had agricultural surpluses, inherent limitations of animal-drawn haulage make it fundamentally unsuitable for exporting perishable products. Russia had only one seaport to support maritime trade, Archangel, but conditions in the White Sea, brutal climate of northern Russia, and that port's remoteness from the country's core and its more productive farming areas severely curtailed its potential as a port of export. Strictly speaking, being landlocked was in itself sufficient to rule out successful progress of the country. Staying within those boundaries would have doomed it to stagnation, decline, and eventual carving up by its western and southern neighbors. While Russia's boundaries in the west after the Peace of Andrusovo, 1667, and Treaty of Eternal Peace with Poland, 1686, were quite disadvantageous, they enjoyed peace and faced little threat of invasion. By contrast, southern parts of the country lived under constant threat from predatory Crimean Khanate and its overlord, the Ottoman Empire. In the second part of 17th century, tremendous effort went into fortification of southern borders, the construction of defensive lines made of felled trees and numerous forts that needed to be manned. Situation in southern Ukraine remained quite tense. After the second half of 16th century, when it suffered a number of defeats from European states, Turkey no longer posed an existential threat to the world of Christian Europe. Yet, its military potential was far from exhausted, and its principal efforts in the second half of 17th century focused on Eastern Europe. In 1672, it wrestled from Poland the region of Podolia and strove to establish itself in right-bank Ukraine. This led to Russian-Turkish War of 1676 to 1681, when Ottoman and Crimean Tatar troops attempted to seize Kiev and Chigirin. After pitched battles near Chigirin in 1677 and 1678 they were stopped, and under the terms of 1681 Peace of Bakhchisarai Turkey and Crimea recognized Russian sovereignty over left-bank Ukraine and Kiev, yet lands south of Kiev, around Bratislav, and in Podolia remained under the rule of Turkey and Ukrainian hetman, ruler, Yuri Khmelnytsky, allied with Turkey. That state of affairs, which did not significantly relieve the threat posed by Crimea and Turkey to Russia's southern borders, was not satisfactory to Russia, and it sought any opportunity to remove that threat. Such an opportunity came along with the emergence of anti-Turkish alliance between Austria and Poland, and the crushing defeat dealt to Turkey by Polish King Jan Sobieski in 1683 at the walls of Vienna. One consequence was the return of right-bank Ukraine to Poland. The year 1684 saw the conclusion of anti-Turkish Holy League of Austria, Poland, and Venice. Russia joined that alliance in 1686 following its own eternal peace with Poland and dissolution of peace treaty with the Turks. So-called Crimean expeditions led by Prince Vasily Galitsan were undertaken as part of that coalition's war efforts. The first one took place in May to June 1687, and the second in February to May 1689. The objective of destroying Crimean Khanate was never met. Even though the troops numbered in tens of thousands, even over 100,000 in the second expedition, they suffered heavy losses due to the heat, disease, and lack of forage. During the first expedition, the troops never reached Crimea as they were stopped by burning steppe grasses set afire by the Tatars, while during the second one they reached the Isthmus of Perekop, but stopped shy of entering the peninsula. In summary, by the late 17th century Russia had a calm, even if extremely disadvantageous, border in the west and a rather fraught one in the south. Up to the year 1700, Russia had to pay annual tribute to Crimean Khanate to buy protection from raids by Crimean Tatars. In the northern Caucasus, Russian possessions were bounded by rivers Terek and Sunja and protected by a number of forts. Kabada, then the most organized of many local societies in the Caucasus, was a vassal of Russia, and provided assistance to expeditions against Crimean Tatars and the smaller Nogai horde, while often taking arms against them at its own initiative. In the southeast, the border followed Ural River, then known as Yaik. Major revolts by the Bashkirs in the region east of the Volga River, in 1662–1664 and 1681–1683, were by then suppressed. Siberia, where Russian settlement started at the end of 15th century, was as yet very sparsely populated. Russian population counted no more than 25,000 families, while in the lands along the Amur River in the Far East, which the Russians reached by mid-17th century, they came into contact with Qing China. War with China in the 1680s led to the loss of Russian settlement of Albazin and posed immediate threat to Selenginsk, Udinsk, Nerchinsk, and Irkutsk. Nerchinsk Treaty of 1689 left Russia with the bulk of previously occupied lands, but stopped its further advance along that vector. Domestic situation. By the late 17th century, Russian monarchy of Romanov dynasty, which was established in 1613 following the time of troubles, maintained the same essential features that distinguished it at its inception, even if ideologically it sought to erase collective memory of the circumstances of its assumption of the throne, through election at Assembly of the Land, and emphasized instead its connection with the Rurik dynasty and its divine mandate. The tradition of convening assemblies of the land, Zemsky Sobor in Russian, was done away with, while in the first third of 17th century they were convened fairly often. By the end of 17th century that institution was dormant. The latest assembly was convened in 1653. The Tsar's power knew no legal constraints. Advisory Council of High Nobility, or boyars known as Boyar Duma, had no legally defined status, and served as a purely deliberative body. Its members were appointed entirely at the Tsar's discretion. The only individuals capable of influencing policy-making were the Tsar's relatives and members of his immediate circle. The whole political elite of the country was confined to the sovereign's court, while the executive power operated through the system of chancelleries known as prikazy, from Russian word for command prikaz. The sovereign's court was a pool of individuals from which appointees were chosen to fill all positions of importance in both the central and provincial governments, as well as for special missions. Members of this corporation were arranged into a hierarchy of ranks, and listed in periodically updated boyar lists. The highest-ranking group consisted of Duma ranks, i.e. members of the Boyar Council, boyars, okolnishis, junior boyars, so-called Duma nobility, and Duma dyoks, clerks. The same status was enjoyed by persons occupying senior positions at court: senior equerry, major domo, armourer, treasurer, royal meat carver, keeper of the seal, equerry, master of the chamber, master of the hunt, falconer, and chamberlain, who counted just a few people all told and could be members of the Boyar Council at the same time. The next step in the hierarchy was the so-called Moscow ranks, that is to say the ranks unique to the capital city. That group included such ranks as stolniks, strapchis, servants of the royal household, Moscow nobility, and jiltsi, residents bound to defensive duty. The lowest rank was known as deti boyarskie, literally boyar children, who were in effect the mass of petty nobility serving the state whenever they lived. In the 16th and 17th centuries, there also existed a subgroup of selected nobility who also ranked as members of the sovereign's court but were excluded from it by the end of 17th century. By the late 17th century, the sovereign's court had ballooned. As of 1692, there were 182 members of the top rank, versus 73 in 1667, and the sum total for the court, excluding residents in defensive duty, stood at 7,068 persons, compared to only 1,656 in 1667. Central government operated through the system of 55 agencies, as of 1,698, 36 of which were prikazi, main chancelleries. Of that number, 27 had jurisdiction over matters of the state, 6 over court matters, and 3 over church matters. Personnel of those agencies totaled 2,762 individuals, including 23 judges. That was the title of a prikaz head, 5 Duma clerks, who were also prikaz heads, 86 clerks, and 2,648 assistant clerks. Clerks, geoks in Russian, were the pivotal group in government machinery. In terms of their political status, they ranked with, and occasionally above, stolniks and strapchis, servants of the royal household, while in terms of social origins they were closer to the lower strata of the sovereign's court. A third or more did not belong to the nobility, and their children had to enter service at lower ranks. As to the assistant clerks, their social standing was below that of petty nobility. In later times, a forefather's service as an assistant clerk was not regarded proof of noble origins. Razradny prikaz was considered the most important one and bore responsibility for the service of the state system. Its remit included maintaining the record of servicemen classes and making appointments to all court, civilian, and military positions. This prikaz maintained lists of all provincial nobility and periodically compiled so-called boyar lists of all the ranks included in the sovereign's court. It also decided how much acreage of a landed estate every serving member of the nobility qualified for. Pomestny prikaz, landed estate chancellery, managed government-owned lands, maintained a registry of both the government lands available to be awarded as estates and of hereditary, patrimonial, lands. It allocated lands to the serving nobility. 3 of the prikazi dealt with matters financial. So-called prikaz of great revenue collected customs fees and was responsible for maintaining the system of weights and measures. Prikaz of great treasury had oversight of industry and commerce, and was in charge of the mint and coinage. Another special prikaz was responsible for collection of excise duties on sales of tobacco and alcohol. A number of prikazi shared judicial and law enforcement functions. Razboyny prikaz handled all criminal offences committed outside Moscow, while Zemsky prikaz handled the same offences in the capital city and maintained law and order there. Chelobitny prikaz, or Office of Petitions, occupied a special place. It investigated cases involving government officials and also functioned as the highest court of appeal. A whole group of prikazi dealt with military matters. Those partly fell under the jurisdiction of Razradny prikaz, which was not only in charge of personnel, but also directed military operations. Special purpose prikazi dealt with specific categories of the service class: Streletsky, Rifle Guardsman Office, Cossack prikaz, Pushkarsky, Artillery Office, Raytarsky, Cavalry Troops Office, and Inozemsky, in charge of foreigners in Russian service. Posolsky prikaz, literally ambassadorial, i.e. Foreign Affairs Office, was in charge of receiving and sending diplomatic missions and of all other dealings with foreigners, including merchants. It also managed a special fund earmarked for ransoming captives. Iamskoy prikaz performed the functions of a post office. Finally, a whole group of prikazi was in charge of governing peripheral areas of the country. Kazansky Palace prikaz was responsible for the lands of former Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan. Similarly, dedicated prikazi existed for Siberia, Little Russia, i.e. Ukraine, and lands of former Principality of Smolensk. Although the system of prikazi covered all aspects of governance, it was not sufficiently specialized and often had redundancies since the jurisdictions of individual offices overlapped. Judicial system was not separated from the executive. Most petty offences fell under the jurisdiction of landowners, while the rest were tried by provincial governors, or by various prikazi. In major cases, the final judgment belonged to the Boyar Council and the Tsar, who were the highest court of the land. The principal administrative unit was uyezd, county. Those were about 250 in number. Counties evolved from former rapinage, or patrimonial, domains, and therefore differed widely in land area and population. legal system of that time was based on the Law Code of 1649, which in turn was based on the Law Code of 1550 with incorporation of all subsequent decrees and rulings. The code was a compendium of 967 articles arranged into 25 chapters. Its content was dominated with issues relating to the Tsar's powers and service of the state system, and with definitions of status and duties of various social groups, the serving class in particular. As in all European countries, the highest social categories were the serving class and the clergy. The clergy, which following the convocation of 1667 was outside the jurisdiction of secular courts, gradually evolved into a distinct autonomous corporation. Through its senior hierarchs, archbishops, bishops and abbots, it played a noticeable political role, even though the Church's claim of primacy over the power of Tsars, as pursued by Patriarch Nikon, was decisively suppressed in 1666 by Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich. In their role as princes of the Church, metropolitans and bishops, there were 15 dioceses, were large landowners with several thousand households of bonded peasants each. Large land areas, that were legally defined as patrimonies, were bonded to monasteries as well. While the Law Code of 1649 banned acquisition of new patrimonial lands by monasteries, by mid-17th century they already owned 83,000 peasant households. Parish clergy was elected by parishioners and confirmed by bishops. Although in formal terms the clergy could be joined by people from any other social class, as a practical matter it was an exclusive corporation. Candidates coming from clerical families were always preferred as better prepared to perform ministry. Besides, the community of parishioners had little enthusiasm for continued payment of collective taxes for a member who left it. Church Convocation of 1667 expressly condemned ordaining people from outside the clerical estate as priests and deacons. By that time, the nobility was not yet legally defined as a single estate, but the question of whether an individual belonged to it could be answered quite unambiguously. That was a community of all the servicemen who served by patrimony, that is to say their service was hereditary, and their estates were given them as land grants for service. Other than the Church, they were the only class allowed to own land with peasants. Such land grants were conditional on service, and an estate had to be returned to the treasury upon completion of service to the state. If a son continued to serve following his father, he could inherit the estate. Widows and orphaned children of noblemen who died while serving also qualified for small estates. Members of the serving class could also have patrimonial estates, which were unconditionally owned and inherited, and freely disposed of by their owners. As a rule, those were owned by heirs of former appanage princes, or in general, by the highest nobility. Since all nobility were bound to serve, there was no dramatic difference between owners of granted versus patrimonial estates. Frequently one person could own both. All male offspring of the nobility were duty-bound to serve, sometimes starting at a rather tender age, and they were the only ones with the right to enter service by patrimony. By 1678, estate owners numbered 20.8 thousand, of whom 9.7 thousand, 47%, had fewer than 20 peasants, 8,000, 38%, owned between 20 and 100, and 3.1 thousand, 15%, over 100. The total noble estate, with all family members, then stood at 158,000, 1.7% of the population. Twice a year all servicemen had to show up for muster. They had to be ready to answer the call to arms immediately with horses, people, and armaments, which is to say they had to be outfitted out of their own money and bring along a number of armed and mounted men depending on the size of their estate. Dodging service was punishable by the whip and full or partial confiscation of the estate. Members of the sovereign's court served in rotation, initially for 4 months a year, and by late 17th century, as the court expanded, for 3 months a year. A class below servicemen by patrimony consisted of servicemen by selection. That category included streltsy, rifle guardsmen, city Cossacks, artillery soldiers, and other petty servicemen. Those were typically recruited from relatives of people already in that class and among other free persons. Although their service was in fact frequently hereditary, it was not officially recognized as such and therefore did not entail the same privileges. There was an impermeable wall between this class and servicemen by patrimony. In isolated cases, such as for distinguished service, they could be rewarded with an estate, and their sons would then go on to serve by patrimony. That actually happened on a large scale during and in the aftermath of the time of troubles when the greater part of Russian nobility perished, but there was no established channel for them to become servicemen by patrimony. In peacetime, businesses and trades of these servicemen were taxed just as those of common tradesmen. Town tradesmen consisted of craftsmen, who had the Russian equivalent of guilds, and petty merchants, divided into three ranks depending on revenue and owned property. A significant proportion of craftsmen served the needs of the state. Town tradesmen were not numerous. By the mid-17th century this group counted 40,000 households, with over half of them in Moscow. Tradesmen were taxed and bound to carry certain other obligations. A privileged position was enjoyed by large merchants, known as guests, who were consulted by the court on matters of economic life and could perform certain administrative functions, collection of various taxes and duties. Peasants made up the absolute majority of population and were the largest of groups subject to taxation and performance of specific obligations. Most peasants were bonded to various landowners. By 1678, 67% of peasant households were owned by the serving nobility, 13.3% by the church, and 9.3% by the crown. In other words, about 90% were serfs, while the rest, so-called black plough peasants, were free peasants subject directly to the state. Peasants' obligations included labor duty, working at their landowner's estate for 2 to 4 days a week, and rents in kind and in money. They also had obligations towards the state. Manufacturing of the time was dominated by cottage industry, as the absolute majority of manufactured goods came from peasant and craftsman households. That said, there existed about 30 large manufacturing works. Those were both government-owned, serving the needs of the court, but most importantly of the military, and privately owned by Russian and foreign merchants in industries like copper smelting, iron making, leather tanning, rope making, salt making, cloth making, glass making, etc. Principal areas of metalworking historically evolved south of Moscow, Tula, Serpov, Kashira, and others, and in northwest Russia, Ustyushna, Tikhvin, Lake Onega northern peninsula. Russia significantly lagged behind European countries in large-scale manufacturing, which had a direct impact on its military capabilities. Nobleman militia made up the largest part of Russian armed forces. As in all European, and not only European, countries, cavalry troops were traditionally formed of landowning servicemen and mounted soldiers that they were obligated to bring along. The number of nobility fit for military duty stood at 15 to 20,000, which allowed for fielding up to 40,000, or even more, cavalrymen. Streltsy, rifle guards, shooters in Russian, emerged as early as mid-16th century. Those troops were organized into regiments commanded by colonels. Regiments consisted of 10 sotnias, hundreds, commanded by a sotnik. For the most part, streltsy, so-called city Cossacks, and artillerymen made up city garrisons. At times of war, additional cavalry units with their own commanders were raised among native non-Russian minorities of the country, Tatars, Bashkirs, etc. Additionally, members of obligation-bearing lower classes could be mobilized for auxiliary military roles. Total strength of Russia's army at war could reach or exceed 100,000, but its fighting capacity in a clash with Western neighbors remained rather low, as demonstrated by the wars in preceding centuries. The authorities were well aware of the need to have a standing infantry, which by late 17th century formed the core of all European armies, and they made efforts to address that weakness. Streltsy were permanent troops, but not a regular standing army. They lived in their own allocated city quarters or suburbs and in peacetime pursued various trades. As early as in 1630, during Smolensk War, the first attempt was made to create so-called New Order regiments, at that time formed out of foreign mercenaries, of infantry, reiters, and dragoons. But in peacetime those regiments were disbanded. From mid-17th century, such regiments began recruitment among peasants and tradesmen, yet almost all officer commissions still went to foreigners. Service in those regiments was unpopular with Russian nobility since it meant serving alongside foreigners, who, according to the notions of the time, were the ultimate ignoble people of unknown parentage, and therefore serving with them impugned family honor. By 1692, only 8.6% of officer positions were filled by servicemen of Moscow ranks. Nonetheless, those infantry and cavalry regiments gradually expanded, and during the reign of Fyodor Alexeyevich there were 48 regiments of the infantry and 26 of reiters and lancers. An important aspect of Russian society of that time that affected efficiency of both government and the military was its aristocratic nature, whereas the nobility of one's family was a principal consideration in all appointments and career advancements. Precedence system brings that aspect of society into high relief. Its logic suggested that a person whose forefathers occupied a higher position in service could not possibly serve under someone whose forefathers occupied a lower position. Anyone to agree to such an appointment would lower the future status of all his kin and descendants. At the time when considerations of family honor dominated the world view of serving classes, appointments inevitably gave rise to numerous disputes, quarrels, and litigation. Such prejudice was so deeply ingrained in the public opinion that even a Tsar had to take it into account. He could not appoint into a position of importance someone more gifted, but less noble than alternative candidates. In particularly crucial cases, a pronouncement would be issued that during a particular campaign everyone will serve without precedence, which meant that appointments during such a campaign would not count toward future calculations of precedence. Even though precedence system first and foremost constrained freedom of action of supreme power itself, it was abolished only in 1682, but even after that one's family origins remained the key to career growth. Opportunities available to those entering government service were also extremely unequal. In theory, the Tsars could elevate any member of the nobility to the highest rank, that of a boyar. But prior to that, someone of humbler origins had to climb through all the ranks below, which happened quite infrequently. At the same time, members of about 20 highest-born family clans became boyars by default, skipping even the preceding rank of okolnishi, junior boyar. Those from the next lower tier of noble clans entered service as junior boyars, and those from an even wider group of noble clans started out as stolniks and strapchis, servants of the royal household. While an impenetrable wall separated those who served by selection from those who served by patrimony, the latter group was also divided by informal but quite tangible partitions. The highest two, Duma and Moscow ranks, were mostly self-replenished, as the majority of their membership had ancestors who served with the same rank. The overwhelming majority of rank-and-file nobility, deti boyarskie, or petty nobility, inherited their parents' status and position with no prospect of career advancement. All of that made it most difficult to promote gifted people into senior government and military positions. Political situation at the beginning of Peter the Great's reign. Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, the second Romanov, died in 1676. His youngest child was Peter, born on May 30, 1672 by the Tsar's second wife. That second marriage of Alexei Mikhailovich brought about a bitter strife between numerous relatives of his first wife, the Miloslavsky clan, and a smaller clan of Narishkins, to which Peter's mother belonged. The Narishkins had the backing of the most influential public figure of that time, Boyar Matveyev, but their attempt to elevate underage Peter to the throne failed. The oldest son, 14-year-old Fyodor Alexeyevich, became the new Tsar. His rule was completely dominated by influence peddling of his kin from the Miloslavsky clan. Being of feeble health, Fyodor died in only 6 years, in 1682. After that, the Narishkins gained ground because of the two remaining sons. The older one, Ivan, from Miloslavskaya, was sickly and feeble-minded, and Peter clearly made a much more promising successor to the throne. Yet in anticipation of that a cabal formed at the court that staked its hopes on one of Alexei Mikhailovich's daughters, Princess Sophia. That cabal included Prince Vasily Galitsan, Prince Ivan Hovansky, and Ivan Miloslavsky. When clear preference for Peter emerged, the boyars and Patriarchio Akim leaned in his favor, and crowds in the Kremlin square shouted their acclamation. The cabal resolved to drastic measures by instigating a revolt of Moscow's Streltsy troops. The Narishkins and Matveyev, who just returned from exile, had no time to act. On May 15, 1682, Streltsy, enraged by planted rumor that the Tsar Ivan has been murdered, stormed the Kremlin and summarily dispatched some Narishkin supporters, while others of that circle were exiled. Power passed to Princess Sophia, who was installed as regent for underage Ivan and Peter. Yet, the Streltsy, led by Prince Hovansky, slipped out of control of Sophia's circle and presented the threat of turning into a force of their own capable of dictating terms to Sophia. Sophia hastened to wipe out that threat through an abrupt execution of Prince Hovansky and his son. That left the revolt without leadership, and by year's end Sophia disposed of its principal instigators. The most prominent figure of Sophia's 7-year-long reign was Prince Vasily Galitsan, one of the best-educated people of his time and well familiar with European culture. Although Peter took part in court ceremonies required by the protocol, he seldom stayed at court, and mostly lived in Preobrazhenskoye village in the environs of Moscow. During Sophia's reign, he was not considered to be the first in line to the throne, and no particular attention was given to his education. To a large degree he was left to himself. That gave him the opportunity to indulge freely in his favorite pursuits, which were quite diverse and rather uncommon for someone in his position. Since childhood, Peter had an interest in various crafts, machinery, and devices, which he had access to through meeting members of German colony in Moscow. Besides, his direct exposure to a diverse and large group of people from unprivileged classes, especially playmates and peers in age, gave him a good notion of what their interests, habits, ways of thinking, and attitudes were. His greatest passions were the art of war and seafaring. 2 amusement regiments trained along European lines were formed for his games and eventually grew into a real fighting force. Interests of that kind and the broad outlook he had developed could not help but give Peter a good idea of the ambiguity of his position at court. In 1689, he turned 17 and got married, which paved the way for him to remove Sophia and rule in his own right. That was equally well understood by Sophia, who had no intention of surrendering her position. An open conflict became unavoidable and came to a head on the night of August 8, 1689. Just as she did 7 years earlier, Sophia decided to rely on Streltsy. They were commanded by Fyodor Shaklovity. A rumor was circulated that Peter's amusement regiments were on the march from Preobrazhenskoye to Kremlin. Streltsy were alerted and prepared for combat. Upon learning about Streltsy moves, Peter, who was rousted out of bed, and a small group of his confidants raced to Trinity Sergeyoslavra, a great monastery close to Moscow, where he was soon joined by his 2 amusement regiments, Preobrazhensky and Semyonovsky, and some other units. Thus, an openly rival power center opposed to Kremlin emerged, and the gauntlet was thrown. The Kremlin and the Lavra started to exchange messages and jockey for supporters. The face-off lasted about a month. Initially, Sophia had greater forces, but they gradually melted away. As a legitimate and no longer minor ruler, Peter attracted more followers. Sensing the precariousness of her position, Sophia traveled to the Lavra for parley, but Peter ordered her to go back to Moscow, where she faced loss of support from Streltsy as well. Streltsy demanded that Shaklovity be surrendered. He was sent to the Lavra and soon after executed, while Sophia was confined to Novodevichy nunnery. Following Sophia's ouster, the business of daily government was entrusted to a circle close to Tsarina Natalia Kirillevna. Lead roles were played by her brother Lev Narishkin, Prince Boris Galitsan, Peter's closest confidant during his stay at Preobrazhenskoye, and some others. Preoccupied with military maneuvers on ever-expanding scale and with construction of ships at Pereyaslav, Pleshchayevo, Lake, Peter did not involve himself in daily governance. In 1693, he visited Archangel where he studied foreign-built ships and laid the keel for his first seagoing vessel. It was in those years that the circle of close associates crystallized around Peter, the people who in future would lead Russia's government and military. After his brother Ivan died in January 1696, Peter became the sole ruler. 96.